For over 30 years, Johnny Carson ruled late-night television with his impeccable charm, sharp wit, and legendary ability to make guests feel at ease. But behind the smooth talk and polished performances, The Tonight Show was sometimes graced by a different kind of spectacle, one that would leave even the most composed guests completely unraveling on national television. We're talking about those unforgettable moments when Hollywood's biggest stars, perhaps feeling a little too confident after a few drinks, found themselves stumbling through interviews, slurring their words, or turning what was supposed to be a normal chat into something bordering on a train wreck. In an era before social media and publicists controlled every public appearance, celebrities sometimes showed up to NBC's Burbank studios with more than just a little bit of liquid courage. And let's just say, not every guest was able to maintain their composure under the bright lights of Carson's stage. From literary icons to Oscar winners, some guests arrived prepared for a casual chat and left us with television gold, completely inebriated, out of character, and at times, on the verge of disaster. What made these drunken appearances so remarkable wasn't just the awkwardness or the sheer unpredictability of what could happen on live TV. It was watching how Johnny Carson, always the professional, navigated these wild moments. He didn't panic or shut things down. He redirected, rephrased, and kept the conversation going. His skill in turning what could have been career-ending moments into television history is what makes these episodes stand out. So sit back, relax, and pour yourself a drink, though hopefully not as strong as the ones these guests had, as we count down the most famously drunk guests who ever graced Johnny Carson's Tonight Show stage. These weren't just interviews gone wrong, these were the times when the show veered completely off script and into the unpredictable world of live television. 1. Truman Capote, the drunken literary genius. In 1980, Truman Capote, the brilliant author behind In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, made an appearance on The Tonight Show that quickly became infamous. Known for his razor-sharp wit and sharp observations, Capote was typically composed in interviews. But on this night, something was off. From the moment he stepped onto the stage, it was clear he wasn't quite himself. As Capote stumbled to his seat, viewers could immediately sense something was amiss. His speech was slurred, and his body language was erratic. What followed was a 17-minute interview that went off the rails. Carson, ever the professional, tried to steer the conversation but struggled as Capote slurred through his responses, frequently mumbling incoherently. Capote's anecdotes became more bizarre by the minute, often veering wildly off topic. At one point, he told an incomprehensible story about Montgomery Clift, only for the audience to lose track of where the story was going. But the real standout moment came when Capote, apparently forgetting he was on live television, turned to Ed McMahon and, in a half-dazed tone, asked if he could sit on his lap. Carson, visibly frustrated yet ever graceful, tried to salvage the interview, but the situation had already reached a point where even he couldn't redirect it. At one point, Capote went to take a sip of water and nearly missed the glass entirely, sending water spilling down his chest. A rare early commercial break was called to give everyone a breather. Off-air, Carson reportedly called it a hostage situation in slow motion, and Capote never appeared on the show again. This awkward moment captured the painful reality behind Capote's public persona and the struggle with substance abuse that would define the later years of his life. 2. Shelley Winters, the unstoppable force. Shelley Winters, the two-time Academy Award-winning actress, was known for her larger-than-life personality. On The Tonight Show, her appearances were often unpredictable, fueled by a few pre-show cocktails. But in 1974, Winters' drunken antics reached a new level, turning what should have been a typical interview into complete chaos. From the moment Winters walked on stage, her unsteady gait and slurred speech were impossible to ignore. Carson barely had a chance to introduce her before Winters launched into an unrelated and rambling story about her past, ignoring all of Carson's attempts to redirect the conversation. But things quickly spiraled out of control. Winters, who was supposed to be promoting her autobiography, dismissed Carson's questions with a wave of her hand and instead began regaling the audience with stories of Marlon Brando, ignoring the book entirely. As the segment continued, she interrupted Carson and another guest, a young actor, and even placed her hand on his knee while making wildly inappropriate remarks. But the most outrageous moment came when Winters, clearly emboldened by her alcohol consumption, snatched Carson's cue cards right out of his hands, tossing them across the set while announcing, "You won't be needing these, Johnny. I'm much more interesting." The audience gasped as Carson, visibly irritated, attempted to regain control, but it was clear that the segment was beyond saving. Winter's appearance was so off the rails that Carson reportedly vowed never to book her again. True to his word, she disappeared from The Tonight Show for nearly 3 years. When she finally returned, there were strict conditions, including an earlier interview time to minimize her alcohol consumption before the show. Winters, however, was never quite the same guest again. 3. Dean Martin, the drunk act that became too real. Dean Martin was a beloved entertainer, known for his smooth charm, relaxed demeanor, and, of course, his seemingly perpetual, drunk persona. For years, he played up the image of a slightly tipsy crooner, always holding a martini glass and slurring his way through performances. But what began as a well-crafted act slowly became a reality, as Martin's off-screen struggles with alcohol began to bleed into his on-screen appearances. By 1976, when Martin appeared on The Tonight Show, the line between act and reality had blurred. The actor and singer, who was supposed to be promoting an upcoming NBC special, arrived noticeably impaired. From the moment he walked onto the stage, it was clear that something was wrong. His usually smooth swagger was replaced by a stumbling gait, and his speech was heavily slurred. Carson, ever the professional, tried to steer the conversation, but Martin was barely able to form coherent sentences. When Carson asked about his upcoming special, Martin responded, "What special?" He seemed genuinely confused, asking at one point if he was on the Merv Griffin show instead of The Tonight Show. As the interview continued, Martin grew more disoriented. At one point, he even began singing, "Everybody Loves Somebody," mid-interview, asking in the middle of the song if the show was live. The interview became more painful with every passing minute, as Carson struggled to keep Martin on track. The low point came when Martin asked where Sammy Davis Jr. was, despite the fact that Davis wasn't even scheduled to appear that night. The segment ended with a merciful commercial break, and backstage, Carson reportedly expressed concern to his producer, saying, "That wasn't the Dean Martin we know." This appearance marked the end of Martin's frequent Tonight Show appearances. Carson, who had known Martin for years, reportedly said he couldn't risk another interview like that. 4. Raymond Burr, the shocking fall from grace. Raymond Burr, best known for playing the unflappable defense attorney Perry Mason, had built an image of stoic professionalism over the years. But in 1970, his appearance on The Tonight Show shattered that polished persona and revealed a side of Burr that no one had ever seen before. Burr arrived nearly 40 minutes late, forcing the production team to scramble. When he finally took the stage, it was immediately clear that something was off. His tie was crooked, his hair was disheveled, and his face was flushed. He gripped the back of the guest chair to steady himself before sitting down. This was not the Raymond Burr the audience was familiar with. Carson, ever the pro, tried to ask Burr about his career and current projects, but Burr had other ideas. Instead of discussing his work, Burr launched into a rambling, incoherent monologue about his orchid collection, a personal hobby of his, but one that had nothing to do with the interview. For 10 long minutes, Burr talked about his greenhouses and breeding techniques in Fiji, drifting further from any coherent thought. At one point, Carson asked Burr about his famous role as Perry Mason, but Burr, looking genuinely confused, asked, "What did you say your name was again?" This was a shocking moment, especially considering Carson had just introduced him minutes earlier. The audience laughed nervously, but Carson was visibly taken aback by the question. The segment ended with a rare moment of desperation from Carson as he tried to regain control. When Burr's interview finally wrapped up, Carson reportedly told his producer that Burr had gone from courtroom legend to cocktail liability in one night. That would be Burr's last appearance on The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure, and it marked a shift in how the show handled guests. 5. Orson Welles, the genius under the influence. Orson Welles, the iconic director of Citizen Kane, was a genius whose talent for storytelling and his larger-than-life persona made him a regular guest on The Tonight Show. However, his 1975 appearance was one for the books, not for his brilliance, but for his overwhelming intoxication. Welles had consumed several bottles of wine before the show, and it was clear from the moment he walked on stage that he wasn't quite himself. The usually composed and authoritative figure was now visibly flushed and sluggish. Rather than waiting for Carson to ask the first question, Welles launched into a monologue about Shakespeare's problem plays. While his words were slurred, his intellect still shone through, as he continued to speak at length on literary topics. What followed was a bizarre blend of genius and drunken rambling. Welles would veer from Shakespeare to stories about his theatrical experiences, often repeating himself or losing his train of thought mid-sentence. At one point, when attempting to quote from King Lear, he couldn't recall the lines and instead made up his own, speaking with such authority that many viewers couldn't tell if it was a deliberate creative choice or just his intoxicated state taking over. Carson, ever the pro, did little to interrupt, allowing Welles to continue his lecture despite the awkwardness. As the segment dragged on for nearly 14 minutes, Carson's patience was tested. Eventually, he signaled for a break, exhaling in relief. Welles' drunken performance, though uncomfortable, was undeniably fascinating. Carson later commented that, "The genius was there, the sobriety wasn't." Welles continued to appear on the show, but his occasional drunken antics made for some of the most unpredictable and memorable segments in Tonight Show history. 6. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the flirtatious queen of chaos. Zsa Zsa Gabor, the glamorous Hungarian actress and socialite, was known for her flirtatious, often provocative behavior. But in 1973, her Tonight Show appearance took an unexpected turn when she arrived visibly intoxicated. The moment she stepped onto the stage, it was clear that Gabor had indulged in more than just a cocktail or two before the cameras started rolling. Unsteady on her feet, Gabor made her way to the guest chair with Carson's help. Once seated, her speech was slurred, and her responses became increasingly incoherent. Carson, sensing trouble, tried to guide the conversation back on track, but Gabor was on a different mission, one that seemed more about flirtation and less about the book she was supposedly promoting. As the interview progressed, Gabor became more physically affectionate, placing her hand on Carson's knee and making suggestive comments. At one point, she nearly tipped over from her unbalanced position on the couch, and Carson had to catch her. Instead of acknowledging the mishap, Gabor laughed it off, making an even more bizarre comment. "Johnny, you're trying to make the moves on me." The audience reacted with nervous laughter, while Carson tried to maintain his composure. The chaos continued with Gabor interrupting Carson, often shifting the conversation to unrelated topics like her jewelry and multiple marriages. The most shocking moment came when she loudly whispered, "Why talk about boring books when we could discuss your bedroom, Johnny?" Carson, clearly uncomfortable, had no choice but to end the segment early with a commercial break. Despite this wild appearance, Gabor wasn't banned from the show but was instead scheduled for earlier interview times in the future to minimize alcohol consumption beforehand, a strategy dubbed the Zsa Zsa Protocol. 7. Oliver Reed, the guest too wild for Carson. Oliver Reed was known for his larger-than-life persona and his reputation as a drinker. The British actor, famous for his roles in Oliver and Women in Love, was a man who didn't shy away from his love of alcohol. But in 1973, his notoriety for being too wild for even Carson's stage led to his infamous non-appearance on The Tonight Show. Reed had been booked to promote The Three Musketeers, but as the show approached, stories about his recent behavior on other talk shows raised red flags. On British chat shows, Reed had been caught on air performing gymnastics while drunk and making outrageous comments, including dumping whiskey into a plant on a different talk show. The most shocking moment occurred when Reed threatened to strip live on Australian television. As word spread about his increasingly erratic behavior, Carson's producers made the bold decision to cancel Reed's appearance. Even Carson, known for handling difficult guests, wasn't willing to take the risk. This was a rare move for Carson, who had dealt with chaotic moments before but never quite like Reed's antics. Reed publicly declared that American television was too timid, and even accused Carson of being afraid of a real man. Carson, ever the professional, reportedly kept the door slightly open for Reed to return, but it never happened during his tenure as host. Reed's unpredictability, combined with his wild reputation, made him the guest too wild, even for Carson. 8. Peter O'Toole, the eloquent inebriate. Peter O'Toole, the legendary actor known for his unforgettable portrayal of Lawrence in Lawrence of Arabia, was not just famous for his acting skills but also for his epic drinking exploits. By 1978, O'Toole was no stranger to alcohol, and his pre-show rituals often involved a proper lunch, which, in his words, meant hours of Scotch consumption. But it was on The Tonight Show that his mixture of brilliance and inebriation created one of the most unpredictable appearances in late-night history. When O'Toole arrived on set in 1978 to promote Caligula, he appeared composed at first, but it quickly became evident that the effects of alcohol were taking hold. He immediately started commenting on the studio lighting, criticizing it for being designed by someone who hated human skin tones, a peculiar way to begin an interview. As Carson attempted to steer the conversation back to O'Toole's film, the actor launched into an impromptu lecture on the decline of classical training in modern actors. The monologue was eloquent, but increasingly disconnected from the topic at hand. Despite his slurred words, O'Toole's sharp intellect shone through in his ability to string together complex thoughts, making the segment both impressive and uncomfortable. The most surreal moment came when O'Toole suddenly jumped to his feet and began an impromptu fencing lesson with Carson, using a pen as a foil. Carson, caught off guard but always game for unexpected moments, followed along, leading to a hilarious few minutes of physical comedy. By the end of the interview, O'Toole had entirely forgotten about promoting the movie and was recounting wild stories of drinking competitions with his friend Richard Harris. Despite the chaos, O'Toole's drunken appearances remained oddly charming, and he was welcomed back to the show several times. His ability to maintain his eloquence, even under the influence. 9. Richard Harris, the Wild Irishman. Richard Harris, the legendary Irish actor, was known for his powerful roles in Gladiator and Camelot, but his off-screen behavior was equally famous. By the 1970s, Harris had become notorious for his drinking, and his appearances on The Tonight Show were often unpredictable. One of his most infamous appearances came in 1974, when he arrived at the studio visibly intoxicated. From the start, it was clear this interview wouldn't follow the usual script. Harris began with a rambling story about his Hollywood adventures, frequently going off topic and ignoring Carson's questions. As the interview progressed, Harris, in his drunken state, became more affectionate toward Carson, even pulling him into a long, unexpected hug. Carson, ever the pro, tried to redirect the conversation, but Harris continued to drift, telling exaggerated tales and making wild comments. The audience, while amused, could sense the awkwardness. Carson's quick wit was his only tool to handle the situation, but it was clear Harris was no longer in control of the conversation. After a few more uncomfortable moments, Carson wrapped up the segment early, signaling for a commercial break. Backstage, Carson reportedly said, "That's the last time I let him on the show." Despite his earlier charm, Harris's unpredictable nature and alcohol-fueled antics had made him a challenge to manage. This appearance became a reminder of how even the most beloved stars can struggle when their personal demons take center stage.